All right, here we go. So here we are for day two, our second meeting of this class. Now, last time we talked about comparative advantage, which actually is one of the more important topics in all of the international trade. But it turns out that I have some nice videos here that will help us go through and better understand this topic. It is fairly complicated, and it would help if we could do more numerical examples. So these videos are going to be designed to help us do exactly that. We're going to look at some more cases of comparative advantage. And after we've done this a few times, I think you'll find that it's not nearly as terrifying as it appears in the beginning. All right, so let me see. Let's go back to Moodle. And let's see, what do we have here? Global economy. And so I posted quite a few, as a matter of fact, videos. So I'd like to start out with these today, and then we'll do some more numerical examples as we go along, just to make sure we really and truly understand this topic, because it really is that important. All right, so here's what we're going to do. Now, here's the links in the Moodle, but what I'm going to do is actually post this in this chat box. Oops. All right, so that way you don't have to go look at Moodle. You can get at it right now. And so what I'd like to do, of course, is watch it on your own computer. And then when it's over, we'll come back and go over it. All right. So in the meantime, I will pause the sharing. And so let's begin. Let's all watch this video, and then we'll go over it when it's done. Okay. Very good. Oh. Um,
Professor?
yes.
Hello. Sorry I'm late. I couldn't find the Zoom link on Moodle, and I realized you email them to us, so I had to log in. And
All right. So we're watching this video. The link is in the chat room.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Apologies.
That's all right. All right. All right, let me know when you're all done watching it. Okay, so you're done. Good, good, good. All right, so I'm hoping that that help. I don't know. I think yes, very good. So why don't we just quickly go back and refresh our memories from yesterday about what we were actually doing with the comparative advantage. We had that example with England and Portugal. And so what was going on with those two countries? Well, based on the writings of David Hume, we saw that in the early 1800s, we know that England was one of the top industrial powers in the world, and Portugal was more of an agricultural economy. So Ricardo chose to write about the two goods, wine and cloth. He picked them because cloth required manufacturing, obviously, a lot of machinery and equipment, whereas wine growing really depended more on the weather, because obviously England's weather isn't really particularly well suited for wine growing, but Portugal's weather is fantastic for wine growing. So now I made up this example. This is not Ricardo's actual numerical example. We saw that the requirements for making 1 yard of cloth and 1 gallon of wine in each country are listed here. So in this first case, we're going to assume that England can make cloth with only 1 hour of labor, and Portugal requires 5 hours of labor. Whereas when it comes to the wine, England requires 3 hours and Portugal requires 4 hours. So what this means then is that England is more efficient in both goods, but their efficiency is more pronounced with the cloth, where you see it only takes 1/5 as long as Portugal to produce the cloth, but 3/4 as long to make the wine. So Adam Smith would have said, you know what, then there's no point in trading because England is better at both products. All right. Now, David Ricardo came along and said, no, that's not right, because even though it's true that England has an absolute advantage in both goods, it turns out that when it comes to comparative advantage, England and Portugal can still trade because it turns out that England has a comparative advantage in the cloth and Portugal has a comparative advantage in the wine. Okay, so just like in the video where one country was better at both goods and they still were able to trade with each other, the same thing is happening here. But what has to happen is that England, which you can see, its advantage is more pronounced in the cloth. They have to make the cloth and Portugal has to make the wine. Otherwise, none of this works out. All right, so we calculated the opportunity cost for both goods for both countries. So how did that work? Let's see, how do we actually calculate this? So keep in mind that whenever we calculate an opportunity cost, let me just show you in general what that looks like. Okay, let's get that out of here. So the opportunity cost of producing a good. Now, of course, when we produce one good, we have to produce less of another good. In other words, the only way in the short one, with limited resources, the only way we can make more of one good is to make less of the other. So the opportunity cost of producing a good equals the ratio of the amount sacrificed of one good relative or divided by the amount gained of the other good. So the key here is that you always put the sacrificed amount in the numerator of this expression, and you always put the gain in the other, in the denominator rather. All right, so that's the key to all of this. So watch this. So when it comes to England, I want to calculate the opportunity cost of making a gallon of wine. So if we go back to our chart, If I make a gallon of wine, I'm using 3 hours. Those 3 hours could have been used to make 3 yards of cloth. So therefore, that gallon of wine is costing me the opportunity to make 3 yards of cloth. So therefore, we say that the opportunity cost of that wine is 3 yards of cloth, which is pretty expensive. Now for Portugal, though, if I want to make a gallon of wine, that's going to take 4 hours. I could have used that to produce 4/5 of a yard of cloth, okay, because each yard of cloth takes 5 hours. The gallon of wine requires 4 hours, so that gallon of wine prevents me from making 4/5 of a yard of cloth. Okay, so therefore, with Portugal, their opportunity cost is only 4/5. So if I bring these together, you can see that already it's clear that the comparative advantage in the cloth goes to Portugal. All right, even with the absolute advantage going to England in both cases, the fact is that the advantage for England is far greater in the cloth than in the wine. So making wine is something that really should be left to Portugal. And that's what we're going to see. Okay, so their opportunity cost is lower, and therefore it has to be Portugal that makes the wine. Now, the other two are very easy. I'll tell you why. We don't even have to go back to the chart. To make the cloth, the opportunity costs are simply the inverses of these numbers. In other words, if you look at it carefully, you'll see that for England, the opportunity cost of the cloth is 1/3 of a gallon of wine. Yes, right there. And for Portugal, the opportunity cost of making cloth will therefore be 5/4 of a gallon of wine. And so now look, what's happened here is that England's opportunity cost in making cloth is lower than for Portugal, which means that England should be making the cloth, Portugal should be making the wine. And of course, this means they should completely specialize in those two goods and then trade the surplus with each other for the product that they want. In other words, England would like to have some wine, so they'll sell their surplus cloth to Portugal for wine. Portugal would like to have some cloth, so they're going to sell their surplus wine to England in exchange for some English cloth. Now, we don't know exactly what ratio they'll trade at. Okay, but they did mention this in the video. This ratio is known as the terms of trade. All right, now hold on a second. All right, so then we went through this example in which we showed how much output increases as a result of this trade. So I'll tell you what we'll do. I think now that we've reviewed this enough, why don't we move on to the second video where there are going to be more examples of how to determine the cost of the comparative advantage and how much each side should be trading. So the next video, if we go to Moodle, is simply called comparative advantage. And what I'd like you to do is take a good hard look at this and get some more practice. All right, hold on. Let me send you the link. And then we'll watch that too, and we'll gain more insight into how this actually works. All right, so let's check this out. Now, in the meantime, of course, I have to stop sharing. That was pretty interesting. Very good. All right. Now, you might have noticed something fun in this video. Besides, obviously, the comparative advantage discussion, they they use an example of a very, very famous painting, American artist. And so just for the fun of it, because we like polls so much, let's just quickly see who recognized that painting. Okay, now if you don't know, you don't know. I just was wondering if anybody recognized it. Let's see. Um, all right, let's just give that a shot, just for the fun of it. Yes. All right. So yes, the winner is of course American Gothic. Let me just quickly show, and then we'll get right back to work. I just thought, just because they brought it up themselves, you'd find this interesting. You've probably seen this painting anyway. Now that you've seen the whole thing, this is what it actually looks like. Yeah, you must have seen that somewhere before. Now, yes, no, actually, the man there is actually the painter's dentist. The lady, I don't remember how she's related. She's either related to the dentist or to Grant Wood. I'd have to look that one up, but I know that this gentleman is actually Grant Wood's dentist, and he apparently agreed to be in the picture, and so history was made. Okay, in fact, we could find out real quick. Who are the people in American Gothic? Oh, okay. So Grant Wood is a painter. That's his sister and their dentist. Okay, that's what it was. Yep. Oh, there they are. Look at that. They've got an actual picture though. I've never seen that before. So, okay. How do you think he did? Not bad. All right. So anyway, so of course now the whole purpose of that video was to explain one more time about the concept of comparative advantage. And you can see that they each have different skills with respect to fish and bananas. So ultimately, the person who's most skilled at creating fish is the one who should be exporting them or trading them to the person who maybe isn't better at either, but has less of a disadvantage in the case of the bananas. Okay. All right. So now the next video and the last one we're going to look at today is a little bit different because this one is going to spend more time on the numerical examples. And then when we're done with that, we can get back to our example and make sure that we really and truly, once and for all, really understand it. Okay. So let's take care of that. Now, when we're done with that, well, we'll see what happens. Hold on 1 second. Let me go get the third video. And let's see, where is it? It's floating around here somewhere. Let me just open up a new copy of Moodle. And we'll just look at one more video before we get back to our material. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Here we go. Comparative advantage practice, right? So in other words, the focus here is more on numerical examples. Okay, so let me just send it to you, and then we'll finally be done with this topic. Let me just send this out to you, and then we'll take a look at it. All right, let's check it out.
Mexico, I already have the chart. Answer the questions at the bottom, keeping in mind this is an input question, okay?
All right, is everyone done? All right, so, oh, here we go. Yes. All right, good. So now what I want to point out here is that if you look on Moodle here, I just posted this. We have our first problem set of the semester. Now, this is not intended for you to hand it in. It's just for practice. Now, you see, it's exactly what we've been doing. So what I'd like you to be able to do, since today's Thursday, and since we should be in pretty good shape with this concept by now, you can go through the slides if you need to. You can watch the videos again, but between now and Monday, what I'd like you to do is work on these problems, and we can go over them next Monday to make sure that you're comfortable with this concept. But again, I'm not going to collect them. We're just going to go over them together just to make sure we really understand this. Okay. In the meantime, what we're going to do is sort of take a look behind the scenes and try to get a deeper understanding of exactly how countries obtain a comparative advantage in the first place. So this is something that Ricardo and Adam Smith never really addressed. Why is this happening? Why do some countries have a comparative advantage and why do other countries not have a comparative advantage? And so we're going to take a step back and sort of look at some of the reasons why this might be happening. All right, so this is not very quantitative what we're about to look at, but it's a little bit maybe more theoretical. We're just trying to help ourselves understand how and why a country can obtain a comparative advantage in a good or service. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Now, this is, I haven't posted it yet, but this is chapter 3. I'll post that maybe tonight. And so I just want to get started and looking at this chapter. We'll finish it on Monday after we review those practice problems. So this chapter is chapter 3. It's called The Sources of Comparative Advantage. All right. Now, some of this depends on a little bit on microeconomics. That's all right. We'll go over this as we go along. We're going to be considering many possible sources of comparative advantage, which discusses the factors that help determine if a country does in fact have a comparative advantage in the production of a good or service. Now, one of them is something called factor endowments. Now, if you've already had basic micro or macro, you'll recall that the factors of production, as they're called, are normally assumed to fall into one of these 4 categories. We have, as you can see, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Now, these factors are things that are used to produce consumer goods and services. They're often called in economics factors or factors of production. So let's take a closer look at these categories. We have land, which doesn't just mean land, okay? That's a little too narrow. It refers to all natural resources, including land. Okay, so what other things could be included in land? All right, let's think about this for a second. Land includes, how about crude oil? Yes, that counts. How about water, minerals? I guess we could make the case that precious metals belong in here too, because they are, they're natural resources. And, basically, like I said, anything that involves natural resources could be considered to be an example of land. So we clearly need land to produce goods and services. What about labor? Well, this is something that we know very well. Labor can be broken down into 2 basic components, physical and mental labor. Okay, so in other words, some products, for example, a product such as, or let's say an industry such as, let's say, farming or fishing, requires a significant amount of physical labor. Okay, now if you've ever seen that show, Deadliest Catch, you know that this is true. Those guys and those crabbing ships, they really work very, very hard to get those crabs. So on the other hand, in industries such as software, requires not a whole lot of physical labor except running your fingers across the keyboard of a computer. This requires a significant amount of mental labor. Now, of course, we need both to produce goods and services. So both of these are considered types of labor, as you can imagine. And then what about the third category? We have capital. Now, here we have to be very careful with this word capital. It can be used to mean a lot of different things. Okay, so here we're referring to really 2 types of capital. We have physical capital, and these are goods such as, let's say, buildings, equipment, machinery, computers that are used to produce consumer goods and services. But we also have this other interesting category called human capital. Okay, these are skills and education that are used, skills, let's say skills, education, and training that are used to produce goods and services. So we think of these as the two basic types of capital that are resources that are needed to produce consumer goods and services. Now, let me show you another meaning of the word capital that does not count here. So this category does not include financial capital. Okay, this refers to funds that are used to run a business. Okay, businesses can raise financial capital by issuing or selling stocks, selling bonds, or borrowing from banks. Okay, so when you hear the word capital, you have to be careful to make a distinction between physical capital, human capital, and financial capital. We're only counting the first two in this category. These are resources that are needed to produce goods and services. The financial capital is something that we need, of course, to run the business, but it's not being used directly to produce the goods and services we're here. This is used for that very purpose. In other words, if this is a Starbucks, obviously all the machinery in the store is being used to produce goods and services that you buy, as is the human capital, which is the training that the employees receive to produce, let's say, lattes and espressos. And then the last category is an interesting one because this is a very special word, entrepreneurship. All right, what exactly does that mean? Well, what is an entrepreneur? An entrepreneur is someone who combines resources to produce goods and services for a profit, usually for a profit. Okay, so who are some examples of entrepreneurs that we're very familiar with? Who's got an idea? Who can name an entrepreneur that we all know very well? Okay, here's a hint. Oh, here we go. Here we go. How about Steve Jobs? Yes. Jeff Bezos. I don't know. Jay-Z he's just a musician, isn't he? I don't think does he run a company of some kind? If he does, then he would count. And of course, there's a lot of them. Like you could also add to this list, let's say Elon Musk. Now, here's the question. Could Amazon exist without Jeff Bezos? No. I mean, they can have all the capital they want and all the human resources, but without Bezos there to run the show, there would be no profits for Amazon. So the entrepreneurs are the ones who come up with a vision. They create a company, they gather up all the resources, and hopefully they're able to produce products that people want and are able to buy and sell them at a profit. So the entrepreneur essentially ties together all the other resources. Okay, yes, and there's so many more examples. I think Bezos decided, you see, he was the CEO, which means he was responsible for the day-to-day running of the company. I think he's decided that by now he's so crazy rich that he's essentially going to just let somebody else run the company, collect all of his money, and then run around the world doing other stuff that he feels like doing, which I don't even know what he's planning on doing. But he no longer has to, let's say, come to the office every single day. He's now just going to own the company rather than run it. That happened with Steve. Oh, we almost forgot Bill Gates. Same thing happened. Gates stepped down a long time ago. He's got his money, and he doesn't show up at Microsoft anymore. He's not really even associated with the company anymore. But I guess you could think of him as being retired. I have no idea what Bezos's plans are, but this way he doesn't have to actually run the company anymore. But he still owns it. He would never sell it. He'd have to be crazy to sell it. Now, having said that, I'm sure they're still going to ask him his opinion about different decisions, but he's not going to be actively involved in the running anymore. Who knows what he's planning on doing? All right, now, so we have this factor endowment theory. Now, remember last time we looked at a brief history of international trade theory, and we were talking, let's see, let me go back and get those slides back just to remind us what topics we were looking at. We had mercantilism. Remember, that's the theory that countries should exploit each other through international trade. We have the price specie flow mechanism from David Hume, which shows that that approach is not going to work, basically. We have absolute advantage from Adam Smith, and we have comparative advantage from David Ricardo. So this brings us up into the early 19th century. So now here we're looking at the beginning of the 20th century, and these two Swedish economists have decided that they would like to take David Ricardo's work and expand it a little further, because he never really quite got around to explaining how and why countries have that comparative advantage. He basically said, listen, let's assume, for example, that England has a comparative advantage in cloth and that Portugal has a comparative advantage in wine. So they're trying to get a little deeper into the foundations of the theory and further explain why comparative advantage takes place in the first place. And they did eventually win the Nobel Prize for this theory, because it did turn out to be quite important, and it was known as the factor endowment theory. So what they're essentially saying is that different countries have different prices for different goods. But why is that happening? Well, according to this theory, the level of prices in a country depend on the level of its technology, the resources that it has, okay, and those resources are often referred to as factor endowments, and of course the demand for its products. So it stands to reason that the higher the level of technology, the lower should be the costs of goods or the prices of goods in that country. Why? Because the higher is the level of technology, the more productive will be all of our resources. So let me give you a good example of that. So in other words, the higher the level of technology in a country, the lower should be the prices of its goods. This is because technology increases productivity so that the factors of production will be able to create more goods and services. All right, so here's a quick, simple, maybe a silly example. Suppose that one person writes a book with a very expensive Word computer, let's say uses Word. Now, I've heard stories that some authors who really basically grew up without computers still to this day prefer to write their books by hand on these yellow pads that you probably see in the store. And so imagine another person writes a book with a paper and pencil. So now you can see the first author is taking advantage of the technology. The second is not. So the question is, of course, and this is a pretty obvious one, who will finish first? Well, obviously, the person who's using the technology will be able to produce their book a lot quicker because it doesn't take as long to write with a computer than it does to write by hand. So now let's, this will be the author who uses word on a computer. But think about this in terms of countries. So now let's think in terms of, in the US, farmers have access to extremely advanced technology. In some very poor countries, farmers do much of their work by hand. Okay, so which country is likely to have lower food prices? Well, obviously that would be the US, because they have the technology which makes it possible to produce at a lower cost than in poor countries where a lot of the farming is still done the way it was 100 years ago. A lot of it is done with manual labor. So therefore, this is one area where having resources is going to give us a huge advantage. Okay, so what about resources? All right, well, let's think about this. Now, these resources could be anything. Let's say that we have two countries. One country has a great deal of land. Let's think about land itself on which to grow crops. And another country has very little land. Let's say the first country is the United States, and the second country is Japan. In which country are food prices likely to be lower? Well, of course, I think you know the answer to that, and that would certainly be the US. So we can see that technology, improved technology, can reduce the costs of producing goods and services, as will the availability of resources. Now, the third category here that Heckscher and Olin were talking about was demand. Now, that's a little bit different because the demand for a product could be anything. That every country is very different. So, in general, the greater is the demand for a product. As you already know from having micro or macro, the higher will be the price of the good. Okay, it's just that simple. All right, now, having said all that, in the Heckscher-Olin theory or factor endowment theory, they're going to basically assume, just to keep things simple, that all countries have access to the same technology and the demand for their goods are very similar. So therefore, what comparative advantage ultimately comes down to the availability of resources. Okay, the more resources we have, the lower will be our cost of production, and therefore we'll have an advantage over other countries, and that means we'll have a comparative advantage. So let's think back to David Ricardo and Portugal and England. In David Ricardo's example of Portugal and England, Portugal, now this is again the beginning of the 19th century, had much more farmland and warmer weather than England, which meant that Portugal had a comparative advantage in the production of wine. England had much more capital equipment and trained workers, and was able to produce cloth more cheaply than Portugal. So Ricardo didn't specifically address this question, but Heckscher and Olin would have said this is the reason why trade can take place between these countries. Ultimately, it comes down to the availability of farmland in Portugal and machinery and equipment in England, which is why this is happening. Okay, so therefore, according to this theory, each country will specialize in and export the products which require the use of its, what we're going to call, abundant resources. So we're going to make a distinction here. A country that has a lot of one type of resource, those are said to be abundant, and the resources which are not so abundant are called scarce. These are the terms that they actually used. So again, looking back at Ricardo, we would say that England had an abundance of capital and Portugal had an abundance of land. Okay, and so that's what ultimately determined the pattern of trade between the two countries, and that came from their comparative advantages in those two goods. So it sounds like a pretty uncontroversial theory, although it does make a lot of assumptions. Now here in this example, we could say that the US has an abundance of capital compared to China, but a scarcity of labor. So what happens is the US will produce goods that require a lot of capital, like aircraft. And they'll let the Chinese make the labor-intensive goods, like clothes, and we'll buy their clothes, and in exchange, we'll also sell them our aircraft. So this is an example of how that theory works. Okay, and the bottom line is the US can make aircraft more cheaply because we have more capital, more specialized specially trained workers. China has the advantage in the labor, okay? And of course, maybe it's not clear, but clothes do require a certain amount of manual labor to be produced, whereas aircraft obviously is being built with machinery. All right, now one of the interesting consequences of this theory is that according to this, as trade starts taking place, the returns to these factors will actually become more equal in the two countries. Okay, so in other words, as trade starts taking place and we start selling airplanes to China and they start selling clothes back to us, what we're going to see here is that wages, let's mention this, as trade takes place, before we start, before trade, labor is expensive in the US and cheap in China. As trade takes place, there is a greater demand for labor in China and a smaller demand for labor in the US. Therefore, so this is where this theory is going. Therefore, wages should rise in China and fall in the US. In principle, they should equalize. They should eventually be equal to each other, at least in this industry. All right, so that's what the theory is telling us. It's not only the fact that these factors are determining who has comparative advantage, but the fact is that if trade keeps taking place, the discrepancies in wages and other factor payments should shrink over time. Okay, so that would be one of the consequences of international trade, which is based on comparative advantage. Okay. Now here, by the way, we're specifically looking at the labor that makes clothes, which we will define here as unskilled labor. Now, I don't know if that's a fair characterization, but they're not talking here about the salaries of engineers who are building aircraft. They're talking about the salaries of people who work in the clothing industry, which we'll define here as unskilled. So, right, okay. So now at the same time though, capital, whoops, hold on. Let me add this to what we just did. Before trade, capital is very expensive in China and relatively cheap in the US. As trade takes place, demand for capital rises in the US and falls in China. As a result, returns to capital rise in the US and fall in China until they eventually become equal, or they could get very close to that. Okay, so this is again one of the consequences of this trade theory is that, and let's throw this in here as well. So in other words, before trade, labor is expensive in the US. Labor is cheap in China. After trade, and this is again according to the theory, labor costs are the same in both countries, or pretty close. It doesn't, maybe not perfection, maybe it's not exactly the same, but it'll be very similar. Now, what about the cost of capital? And again, before trade, capital is cheap in the US, capital is expensive in China. With trade, the cost of capital will be the same, more or less, in both countries. Okay. Does that make sense? So you can see Heckscher and Olin are basically trying to take Ricardo's theory and sort of expand on it and analyze, first of all, where is comparative advantage coming from? And secondly, what are the consequences of trade? And you can see they're explaining it in terms of the returns to resources. Okay, now, not so much in terms of unemployment or anything else, but in terms of the returns to resources. Now, if this does actually happen, then if the returns are equalized, if the returns to resources are equalized, then no further of expansion of trade would take place. Okay, so in other words, you're essentially reaching a limit to how far you can push this taking advantage of comparative advantage. In other words, comparative advantage disappears when resource prices are equalized. All right. So that's one way of explaining what is happening, what is causing comparative advantage to take place, and what are the long-term consequences of it. Okay, there's other theories that we'll be looking at as well, which will explain things like what happens, for example, to the domestic workers, to foreign workers, and what happens to employment and all this and that. But right now, I think that, you know what, since you have this project to work on, so, well, okay, now remember, you're supposed to work on this global economy problem set. You're not required to hand it in, but the more of it you do between now and Monday, the more you'll find out if you really understand what we're doing. So don't forget about this. Okay, you'll get a lot of good practice with these problems. And when you're done with it, you'll understand everything you need to know about comparative advantage. And then as we use it later on, it'll make perfect sense to you. All right, so does anybody have last minute questions? No? Well, all right then. I think it's time to stop, especially because we're coming up on a weekend. All right. So I think it's a little early, but let's stop right here and give yourselves extra time to work on the problem sets. And then on Monday, we'll take care of this problem set, and then we'll carry on with the new material. All right. So I will see you all on Monday then.
Enjoy your weekend.
Okay, you too.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
All right, bye.
Bye, Professor.
Oh, yes, go ahead. Oh, I thought you had a question. Okay, see you later.